In the vast territories once ruled by the Persian Empire, power moved like a silent tide, shaping every life beneath it. Cities were taken, borders shifted, armies advanced, and with each conquest, households changed overnight. For women in defeated lands, the fall of a city was not merely the loss of a home or a ruler. It was the beginning of a new existence under a system that offered little protection and almost no memory of their former identity. Entire communities remembered the battles, but the stories of the defeated women disappeared as if they had walked into history's shadows and never returned. Empires recorded victories on clay tablets, royal inscriptions, and monumental reliefs, celebrating kings, armies, and the tribute brought from distant lands. Yet, behind the triumphs, there were countless individuals whose fate did not enter official memory. These were the women who belonged to conquered households, settlements, and tribes. When their homes were absorbed into Persia, their life changed under a system that rarely documented the powerless. The Persian Empire was known for tolerance in many aspects, yet the absorption of populations after conquest created conditions where personal histories dissolved. For those living under defeated banners, their names, families, and past identities slowly dissolved into the administrative machinery of imperial control. They did not vanish through public ceremonies or grand decrees. They disappeared through silence, paperwork, renaming, relocation, and the quiet reorganization of society. Those who investigate the darker corners of history understand that silence is not innocence. Silence is a form of burial. And across ancient Persia, defeated women lived within systems that erased their origins, leaving behind minimal written traces and almost no personal memory. Even today, historians study surviving inscriptions, economic records, and household registers, only to find numbers where individuals should have been, and roles where names should have stood. Many stories of women in defeated provinces were never meant to be told. The empire valued stability, and stability required the absorption of conquered populations without public conflict. The experiences of those who lived through forced transitions were rarely recorded. Their identities became administrative entries, laborers, attendants, members of households under new authority, never remembered as someone who once lived beneath a different sky. These erasures were quiet but effective. History keeps traces of these absences. When archaeologists uncover archives, they find records of movement. People being relocated to work in royal estates, agricultural lands, or domestic quarters. These individuals appear as numbers, as units of labor, as anonymous figures within the logistics of empire. Their personal history is missing. Their former lives are silent, and their suffering, experienced behind closed doors, remains known only through inference. Behind this immense silence lies a disturbing question. Why did these defeated women vanish without a trace? The empire did not need physical erasure. It relied on administrative transformation. When a population was defeated, its identity dissolved. Names changed or disappeared from record. Family lines were absorbed into new structures. Domestic lives shifted into controlled environments where personal narratives had no space to survive. And this is where history forces us to confront its most unsettling reality. Entire populations of women lived full lives without leaving behind a single written memory. They worked, raised children, endured loss, and navigated daily fear. Yet the empire treated them as part of a silent foundation supporting its grandeur. Their stories existed, but not in archives. Dark Inquest history is one of the rare spaces that seeks to recover these forgotten experiences, not to sensationalize them, but to honor the truth that official history often ignored. This video explores why defeated women in the Persian Empire vanished without a trace. The Persian Empire arose around the 6th century BCE under the Achaemenid dynasty. Stretching from the Greek world to the edges of India, it became one of the largest empires in ancient history. Its rule depended on sophisticated administration, taxation, and provincial management. Conquered populations were not usually exterminated or expelled. Instead, they were integrated. Integration sounds gentle, but for those who lived inside conquered villages and cities, it often meant losing identity, social position, and legal protection. Royal ideology celebrated harmony, unity, and the benevolence of the king. But beneath that political language existed a social hierarchy that kept defeated groups in positions of deep dependency. Women in these conquered areas had very little power to negotiate their fate. Their autonomy depended on the security of their families and on local customs. When those customs were overridden or reorganized by imperial authority, their protection could evaporate overnight. The empire did not openly target them, but defeat placed them in environments where decisions were made without their consent. One of the reasons their memory disappeared was political. Royal scribes had no interest in documenting individual lives unless they belonged to the nobility, the administrative elite, or religious authorities. A woman from a defeated province held no political significance. She could be relocated, absorbed into a new household, assigned to agricultural estates, or brought into controlled domestic environments. These systems were designed to maintain economic productivity and political stability, not to preserve personal histories. The structure of Persian households contributed to the disappearance of identity. Household authority rested in the hands of men with official standing: provincial governors, military officers, local aristocrats, and wealthy landowners. Women, especially those absorbed after conquest, became part of domestic units in ways that were rarely documented. They might have served as laborers, attendants, or household members whose personal lineage was no longer recognized. This was not uniquely Persian. Throughout ancient history, defeated populations lost their social roots. But the Persian Empire excelled at reassigning populations with administrative precision. The empire maintained order by controlling labor flows, and women were often included in these movements. When individuals were relocated from one province to another, the archive noted the transfer. It did not record their story. Defeat also carried psychological consequences. Entire communities experienced uncertainty, fear, and instability. Women who lived through the fall of a city entered a world of unfamiliar laws, unfamiliar social structures, and unfamiliar relationships of power. What they endured remained unspoken, occurring within households and closed spaces where no chronicler stood with a pen. Ancient sources sometimes reference large groups of individuals moved from one province to economic or administrative purposes. The terminology describes them as dependents or laborers. The conditions they experienced are not explained. Yet scholars understand that relocation involved profound emotional shock, the loss of homeland, language, relatives, and personal autonomy. What happened inside domestic environments remains largely invisible. We know that elite Persian households could be extensive, containing many individuals with varied status. Some lived with relative stability. Others lived under harsh discipline that no record describes. The darker experiences existed behind curtains and walls, far from archival ink. We must be cautious not to project modern assumptions onto ancient life. Not every household was abusive. Not every defeated woman suffered the worst fate imaginable. Some found relative security in new environments. Some married into their surroundings and rebuilt families. But what matters historically is that the system made personal stories disappear. Even when a woman survived, history does not remember her name. The Persian imperial elite valued order. Disorder threatened administration, so silence became a form of strategy. Personal narratives, especially those involving suffering, were not preserved. Local poets or storytellers might have kept fragments alive, but the empire did not commit these memories to stone or clay. The women who vanished did not always disappear physically. Most continued to live, raise children, and participate in society. But they vanished as individuals with remembered origins. Their past identity dissolved into new structures. Their children inherited the status of the environment into which they were born, not the lost heritage of their conquered homeland. For historians, the absence becomes a puzzle. In some records, we find entire communities listed without gender identification, without family structures, and without personal stories. We know women existed in these numbers. We know they worked, labored, and endured life under imperial oversight. But the archive sees only the silhouette of a population, not the intimate detail of daily existence. The Persian Empire relied on efficient bureaucracy. Royal administrators dealt in tribute, taxation, and labor supply. Their concern was the functioning of the empire, not the hidden personal histories of defeated women. Records that survived through the centuries reflect only what the empire valued. This silence becomes darker when we consider that some women were taken into domestic or administrative environments where conditions varied widely. Many experienced strict control, limited mobility, and harsh discipline if they violated expectations. These forms of domination rarely produced written testimony. Household discipline was private. Domestic suffering stayed behind walls. Fear alone could erase identity. When individuals knew that speaking out would bring punishment or instability, silence became the only survival mechanism. Entire lifetimes unfolded without public acknowledgement. The psychological weight of defeat left long-term consequences. Generations later, descendants might not even know from where their ancestors had come. As the empire expanded, some conquered populations were moved in large numbers. They became labor communities used to cultivate land or support royal building projects. Others were assigned to serve elite households. These individuals had essential roles, yet their personal history rarely survived. The archive treated them as resources to be allocated, not as people with unique backgrounds. In some provinces, defeated women entered households where they lived under complex hierarchies. At the top stood noble families, followed by attendants with varied levels of status. Below them existed those who had no recognized lineage inside the household. Their identity began and ended within that environment. Their memories of former life slowly faded. The empire did not erase them deliberately. It did not need to. Bureaucracy erased them faster than force. A conquered woman was no longer identified as belonging to a former city, tribe, or culture. She belonged to an administrative category. That category did not record emotion, family ties, or ancestral stories. Once a person's origin disappeared from the archive, history no longer remembered them. Consider how royal inscriptions worked. Kings carved records of victories, tributes, territories under control, and loyalty oaths. These inscriptions glorified unity and power. They did not describe the ordinary lives of defeated individuals. Women from conquered groups existed somewhere behind every victory, but they were not part of the narrative that kings intended to project. Even religious texts of the empire rarely mention women unless they belonged to noble families. When queens or princesses appear in written memory, it is because they connected to power. Women from defeated provinces existed in private spaces, not public ones. Their names did not appear in monumental inscriptions. Their stories survived only orally, inside forgotten rooms. The absence of names is the deepest form of disappearance. When an identity lacks written recognition, history forgets that person ever existed. And yet, these forgotten people shaped households, farms, local economies, and entire generations. Their silence remains heavy. Sometimes, scholars find lists of rations distributed to workers in royal estates. These documents include men, women, and children, all identified by number, not by biography. Some women received measured grain or oil. Their status was determined by their labor or household assignment. Beyond these administrative details, nothing is known. They worked, they endured, and they were forgotten. This is the darkest element. History does not need physical destruction to eliminate memory. It only needs silence. Midway through this reflection, one realizes that continuing to explore these erased lives is a moral responsibility, not merely an academic one. Dark Inquest history exists to recover voices hidden beneath the weight of empire and time, and exploring them together prevents their silence from becoming permanent. Wave after wave of imperial expansion repeated this pattern. When a city resisted Persian control and later surrendered, its inhabitants entered a new legal framework. Some elites negotiated positions within the empire, but ordinary people had no voice. Women depended on the male members of their former communities to secure their protection. When those communities dissolved, they entered unfamiliar networks controlled by strangers. For a woman who once lived with family or tribe, entering a vast imperial household meant losing every familiar bond. The fear of mistreatment lingered, especially when rules were enforced without recourse. The psychological pressure created environments where speaking one's past became dangerous. Silence became daily reality. The empire often respected local religions and customs, but only when those customs supported order. Personal grievances or domestic injustices were not part of imperial concern. A defeated woman could endure hardship inside a household, but unless that hardship disrupted administration, it remained unrecorded. One of the most haunting features of Persian bureaucracy is that it treated human beings as components of state structure. The administrative mind cared about production, not biography. The emotional cost felt by the conquered, especially by women with no authority, did not enter official documents. At the height of imperial expansion, regions from Anatolia to Central Asia fell under Persian control. Local aristocracies accepted Persian dominance to preserve their own positions. Beneath them existed ordinary households that absorbed the friction of conquest. Women lived quietly, carrying memories of former life. But bureaucracy steadily removed the past from recognition. The disappearance of defeated women becomes evident when we compare them with elite women in the empire. Noble Persian women left significant records: grants, property rights, religious dedications, estate management, and sometimes political influence. These women appear in archives because their position mattered. Their existence was part of administrative memory. This contrast is important. The empire remembered elite women to legitimize authority and property rights. It forgot defeated women because their personal existence did not intersect with power. This selective memory produced an entire underworld of history, millions of unnamed lives that sustained the empire from the shadows. They cooked, wove, harvested, raised children, maintained homes, produced goods, and kept daily life functioning. Yet their contributions appear nowhere in the monumental narrative. The climax of this story is not dramatic in public terms. It happens in silence. A city falls. Its administrative structure dissolves. New authority takes control. Families separate or reorganize. Women enter households where their past no longer holds legal value. The doors close. The archive remains silent, and identity evaporates. No official decree announces these disappearances. No chronicler stands outside the household walls. The empire continues to expand, unaware that beneath every triumph lies a quiet accumulation of erased biographies. The forgotten live and die without inscription. Their memory ends with their final breath. Generations later, children inherit only the status of the household in which they were born. Their ancestors' stories exist only as whispers, told without certainty, eventually fading until even the whisper disappears. The aftermath of this silence reaches into modern historical study. When scholars attempt to reconstruct the personal lives of ordinary women in the Persian Empire, they encounter walls of absence. There are legal records, provincial reports, agricultural accounts, and monumental inscriptions, but barely any personal testimony from defeated women. This absence is not accidental. It is the result of how ancient societies valued memory. Memory followed power. Those who lacked power entered the archive as shadows. And yet, the absence itself becomes meaningful. It tells us that control operates not only through force, but through the erasure of personal stories. A person who cannot record her life is forgotten faster than one who suffers openly. Silence becomes a form of disappearance more absolute than imprisonment. Historians now examine these gaps with new techniques, using archaeology, linguistic patterns, and comparative anthropology to infer daily life. The conclusions are indirect but powerful. We know these women existed. We know they lived under constrained autonomy. We know they endured transitions from one political world to another. And we know that their disappearance from memory was systemic. Their legacy can still be felt in the cultural transformations that shaped later societies. When populations were absorbed, their descendants became part of new identities. Diversity was preserved, but memory was lost. The empire did not erase the genetic or cultural presence of conquered women. It erased their names, their stories, and their agency in the historical record. Over time, these erased identities blended into the vast population of subjects living under Persian rule. The empire became a mosaic of peoples, languages, and traditions, many of which were descended from conquered individuals whose personal history is now invisible. In the end, the most haunting truth is this: disappearance does not always mean physical destruction. Sometimes it means living without memory, without acknowledgement, without inscription, without story. Women in defeated regions of the Persian Empire vanished because history refused to see them. They lived full lives, complex, emotional, difficult, resilient, but their stories were too private, too powerless, and too domestic to enter the archive. Their existence supported the empire, yet the empire recorded only the structures above them. And so they walk through history as silent figures, known only by the shadows they cast on administrative records. To speak of them today is not an act of pity, but of restoration. Their silence deserves recognition. Their erasure deserves understanding. And their forgotten lives remind us that history is often written by those who stand at the podium, not those who suffer behind the curtains. May this investigation encourage us to look beyond monuments, beyond royal inscriptions, beyond triumphs carved in stone. True history includes those who labored unseen, who lived without written identity, and whose fading memory deserves to be honored. To preserve the dignity of these forgotten individuals and to continue exploring buried truths across ancient civilizations, subscribe to Dark Inquest History, a place where silence is questioned and memory is reclaimed from the shadows.